For more reaction to today's sentencing of Brady Robertson, we're joined by Steve Sullivan, the Director of Victim Services for MAD Canada. Steve, thanks for joining us. So Brady Robertson sentenced to 17 years in prison minus 34 months for time served, as well as a 20-year ban on driving. What do you think of this sentence? Do you think it is suitable? Did you want to see more?
Well, first and foremost, our thoughts are with the family, their friends, and the community who has clearly suffered this enormous tragedy beyond words. It's really hard to, when you talk about sentences for a tragedy that's enormous, to talk about satisfaction. Clearly, the judge, I think, in her remarks made some really important comments about the scourge of impaired driving, the importance that it's entirely preventable. It was one of the higher sentences we've seen for a crash involving multiple people. But I don't know there's ever any satisfaction for this. Nothing changes for the family.
Yeah, Steve, you know, MAD Canada, this is what you deal with on a day-to-day basis. And we saw at that sort of news conference outside the court hearing today, geez, I'm so sorry, I've forgotten her name just very briefly, but the woman who lost her 3 children and her father, Jennifer Neville Lake, pardon me, she was there today. And they talked about sort of being part of this collective of tragedy and this what they have to deal with here. You know, no matter what the sentence, the victims of these crimes never come back. So how do you sort of counsel and help people work through these things? Because there's all these stages, you know, you have the crash, the investigation, the court, now the sentencing. How do you help people work through these stages of these events like this?
We really try to just be a support in any way we can, providing information, validation. We're good listeners. But I think one of the most important things we do is we try to connect families with other families who've experienced a similar trauma. That kind of connection that people have when they have, whether they've both lost children or maybe lost a partner, that's not something that other, you know, you can't really find elsewhere except among that community. So making those connections for people, giving them a safe space is really, I think, one of the most important things that we do. And the justice system is not, whatever else it might be, is not a place where families find comfort, right? So it's not gonna heal anything. But we find making those connections among individuals to be the most important.
And Steve, what is MAD doing to ensure that there are less, you know, tragedies like this happening? We know that with the pandemic, many people with mental health issues are turning more to various types of drugs, medication. It's not just about drunk driving. Now there's cannabis, there's all kinds of other things that could affect your driving. So what is MAD hoping that the government can do perhaps to really crack down on this issue of impaired driving, I should say?
Yeah, we have, I mean, obviously our focus in the last couple of decades has been alcohol impaired driving, but we know drugs have been an issue for a number of years, even before legalization. So we've really tried to change our educational programs to include drug impaired driving, our public messages. People recognize alcohol impaired driving as a risk. They often don't recognize drugs in the same way. So a lot of education to be done there. We also try to work with provincial governments to bring in administrative sanctions and provincial sanctions that actually have proven very effective. You know, obviously sentencing is important, but sadly, when we're getting there, we've lost, right? We've lost a family, someone's been injured. The key is to try and prevent those things early. So we try to work with all levels of government to bring in the measures, both educational, enforcement, and policies that will prevent people from driving while impaired.
Steve, how are you sort of tailoring your message these days? I mean, there's been different evolutions of, you know, sort of getting that public education out there, whether it's, you know, crash test dummies coming out of vehicles and, you know, high school parking lots, sort of showing the dangers, you know, the pictures of the victims, of the families. How are the messages now changing to try, because ultimately this comes down to a personal choice, a personal decision to drive drunk. And, you know, if people don't understand from the very get-go that they shouldn't do this, I wonder how your message is trying to evolve to try to get through to those people who otherwise may do it.
We recently did a survey of trying to find out why people who admit to driving impaired, why they do it. And their message really is they think they're going to get home safely. It's a short drive. They'll drive carefully. So people don't see themselves getting involved in crashes. We also know that the highest risk factor is males between 18 to 34. So we're trying to develop key messages to that community, that high risk community that will try and address them. They're the ones who make the decisions to drive, not all of them obviously, but to make the decisions to drive impaired. So if we can find a way to speak to those young men and encourage them not to make those choices. There's so many choices now in our communities, whether it's ride sharing or taxis or public transportation. I think that's where we need to focus a little more specifically on the highest risk communities.
And Steve, staying with the point you were making about targeting kind of that demographic for education, do you think on the other side, before these men get their driver's licenses, there should be an additional screening process for their history, background checks, or anything that could kind of, lead authorities to think, okay, this person is suitable to get their license? I know it might sound a bit, aggressive, but do you see that as an option?
Well, I know that Mad Canada, among others, years ago, really advocated for, part of the graduated license, that if anyone, who's getting their license, new drivers, cannot have any alcohol and/or drugs in their system, and that has had some impact. And so I think it's those targeted campaigns at people. Certainly, if there is evidence that someone has driven is at a higher risk category, I would think that, educational programs and trying to change their behavior, because that's the key, right? We want to change their decision making before they get behind that wheel. We know, for example, in the US, there's legislation passed recently that's requiring car manufacturers in the future to have technology that will not allow someone to start their car if they're impaired. So those kinds of things. It's a multi-pronged approach. There's no one solution to impaired driving.
Okay, lots of things to explore, and hopefully nothing like this ever happens again, but we never know. Okay, Steve Sullivan, Director of Victim Services for Mad Canada, really appreciate your thoughts with us today. Thank you.